Do you have particular activities and procedures that you use to engage students in your classroom? Now, many of us have our tried and true go-to activities that are based in CI, or Comprehensible Input. They get talked a lot about on social media, in language teaching circles, at conferences, and of course, on this podcast. In this episode, I'm going to walk you through 15 comprehensible input or CI activities so that you have them all in one place and you'll have access to a free document that you can download so that you have all the details at your fingertips and ready to use in your classroom. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you so much, as always, for taking the time out of your week to join me to think about, talk about, listen to ideas about language teaching. Just one of the many things that you do on a regular basis to be an incredible educator. So thank you very much for doing that. So on this episode, we are going to talk about very specific activities, procedures, just things we can do in our classroom. So we're going to leave all the theory aside for the most part, and we are really going to look specifically at what we can be doing in our classroom. And you're going to be able to walk away with things that you could do this afternoon, this morning. If you're listening to it on the way to school, you could do it tomorrow. So you're going to have lots of really actionable ideas for your classroom. Everything that we'll be talking about is based in the idea of comprehensible input, or CI. Now, this is a large concept that a lot of people are talking about, so just to make sure that we're all on the same page and we know what this is, that when we talk about comprehensible input, or CI, this is language that is understandable to the listener or the reader, even if they don't know all the words or the structures in it. So it's language that's slightly above the learner's current level of proficiency, but still comprehensible. And this concept of comprehensible input comes from Stephen Krashen's original input hypothesis, where he suggested that language is best acquired when learners encounter words and phrases that are just above their current understanding. So this is similar to, say, climbing a ladder, where each step takes the learner slightly higher and pushes their skills further. So this isn't about only presenting language to our students that they completely understand. That's not going to push them to higher proficiency, but where we are giving them an opportunity to use what they do understand to make sense of the language that they don't. So we're making it comprehensible, but not 100%. So when we are using this input, this language we are presenting to students, whether they're listening or reading, there are things that we can do to make the language comprehensible. Now, the more typical ways are using visuals and gestures, all of those things, but we also just want to make sure that we have a solid understanding of what the current proficiency level is of our students, and that's what we refer to as I. Lowercase I is their current proficiency level. Are they novice mid? Are they novice high? So that you have this idea, this accurate idea of what I plus 1 will be. So what will be that slight level above where they currently are? Because if we don't know exactly where they are, then we're kind of throwing a wide net in terms of what that next level up is going to be for them. So we want to make sure that we have a solid understanding of what their current level is, that I, so that we can provide them with that I plus 1. And once we understand that, then we can implement activities and procedures in our classroom that engage students in the target language in comprehensible ways. So though CI is input focused, it's called comprehensible input. But we're going to be looking at is activities so that students can authentically engage with the input, so it doesn't stay at this passive listening and reading, but they're actually going to do something with it. And so even though, yes, it is input focused, authentic student engagement with that input provides opportunities for comprehension checks, and it's going to support their acquisition. So as we see students engage with the input and what they're able to do with it, that's going to be a great comprehension check for us. For us teachers, it's very formative. It's a formative assessment each time they engage with the input, so we can learn a lot from that, which goes well beyond just passively listening or passively reading. But when you actually engage with it, we can have students show us what they're able to understand and what they're able to do with it. So that's going to be a really good formative assessment for us. So I'm going to break down these activities into 3 categories. So we're going to first look at interaction and discussion. So these are activities that are focused on fostering interactive communication in the classroom, which is going to allow students to engage with the language in meaningful and personalized ways. And then we're going to look at a second category, which is focused on storytelling and narrative. And these are the types of activities that involve students in storytelling and narratives that offer a rich context for language acquisition through listening and speaking. And then the third category is going to be reading and writing. So these activities are designed to reinforce comprehension and writing skills through structured and interactive tasks. So I will go through 15 activities that fall into these 3 categories, but just to let you know, there is a link in the show notes, or you can go directly to my website, wlclassroom.com/toolbox, and you will get the link that has all 15 of these CI activities in one document with all of the descriptions that I'm going to be talking about, as well as the tips. And I also put in how long they typically take. So if you want to try one and you can see how much to plan for in your class, how much time to plan for. So you have that entire document that has everything I'm going to be talking about. So don't worry about taking notes on everything. You have the link right in the show notes or at wlclassroom.com/toolbox. So let's get started with the first category of activities, which I'm putting under the label of interaction and discussion. So again, these activities are focused on fostering that interactive communication in the classroom. And this is going to allow our students to engage meaningfully with the language and to do it in ways that are really personalized to them. So the first activity is a picture talk. Now, this is where we display a picture, a single picture, and then lead a discussion in the target language, asking questions and then narrating the scene. This could be through you asking students to help contribute to the narrative, just telling the story that's on there, but using the picture as the help or the support in making the story comprehensible. So a tip for doing this is to use pictures that are culturally relevant or connected to students' interests. This is going to help really boost the engagement. And keep questions simple and gradually move on and increase the complexity of the questions and the language. So that's the idea of a picture talk. And there's really not much to prepare in advance. You're just going to show a picture. You could do this with a projector. You could do it however, hand out a photocopy of a picture. But what you're doing with it is engaging students in using language that they have and then adding on to the story or the narrative of what they're looking at or the description of what's in it. And through doing that, students are going to encounter language and words that are not at their current proficiency level. They're not currently their total comprehension level, that I. So through this activity, they're going to learn new words based on what's in there or based on the ideas that you're presenting that could be happening in the picture. So that is a picture talk. The second activity in this category is what is often referred to as PQA, which stands for Personalized Questions and Answers. So in this type of activity, we are asking students personalized questions related to a theme or a topic, and we're going to encourage them to respond in the target language. And through doing this, they may need some support. They don't have all of the vocabulary or structure to do that. So based on what they are trying to say, we can then help and scaffold that by adding in new words that help them to respond to that question. And one tip for doing this is to tailor the questions to the students' lives to make the conversation relevant. So you also want to use visual aids and gestures to support understanding, but make sure that these are topics that they actually want to be discussing. Because as Stephen Krashen says, that we want the language to be comprehensible, but we also want it to be compelling and of interest to students. So these first two activities, whether it's a picture talk or a PQA, we're really looking at spending 10 to 15 minutes on these types of activities. So we're not spending 45 minutes or an hour-long class. It is a section of the class that's going to keep the language focused on what you are specifically doing at that time, but not letting it linger too much. The third activity in this category is special person interviews. And just last week on episode 179, I had a whole conversation with Bryce Hedstrom, who is the guru of special person interviews. So I'm going to put that link in the show notes so that you can go right back to that and you can listen to in detail what that is. But the quick description here is that it is an interview that we conduct with one student at a time that focuses on them personally, what they like, they don't like, their experiences. And a tip for this is to prepare a set of questions in advance and encourage students to answer in detail. So depending on whatever topic you happen to be doing, use this activity regularly to build a classroom community. And one thing that Bryce Hedstrom pointed out over and over in our discussion is it is so important to ask follow-up questions. So it's not just, do you like movies? But then if they say yes, what's your favorite movie? Who are the actors in the movie? Why do you like that movie? Do you only like comedies? Are there other types of movies that you like? So each question is just a starting point that you have prepared, but then based on the answers, you want to carry on the conversations from there, and you're involving the class in as well. So if a student says, oh, this is their favorite movie, you can then ask everyone in the class, how many other people have a favorite movie similar to this? How many other people in the class prefer comedies? How many other people in the class prefer action movies? So you're also engaging the classroom in the conversation as well as you're doing the special person interview. But episode 179 from last week with Bryce Hedstrom, all about special person interviews, that link is right in the show notes, and I encourage you to listen to that for many more details. The fourth activity is a card talk, and this is where students will draw or write words for things that are of interest to them on a card on their desk. And I would recommend doing this sort of as a table tent on their desks. So it can be both sides, and you can see it without having to walk right up to the desk. And so as students put pictures, if they're very novice, or they can write full sentences or put words on that show what are their hobbies, their favorite foods, their nationalities, their ethnicities, their families, anything that's personal to them, they have on these cards. And then you can use this as a way to engage students. So as you're presenting a new topic or you're having a discussion, you can just look down and say, oh, I see there is a picture of a violin. So you can then, as you're talking about music, you can say, oh, do you play the violin? Oh, yes, you play the violin. Does anyone else play the violin? How long have you been playing the violin? So just by looking at the pictures of the words, you can ask very particular questions that are personalized to the students in your classroom. This is another one of those activities that you'll probably want to spend maybe 10 to 20 minutes on. And as you're doing it, a tip to remember is to allow students to prepare their images ahead of time and use this activity to introduce or reinforce vocabulary. You might want to do it on particular topics or just general, but that is the idea behind a card talk. The fifth activity in this category is weekend chats, and these are exactly what they sound like. This is where we discuss with students what they did over the weekend, but specifically using the past tense if your language has it, and encouraging detailed responses. Now, particularly at lower levels, if we haven't gotten into the past tense in the curriculum yet, we might want to hesitate with this, but you can model how to say these things. And once students see it each Monday or each Tuesday or whenever you're doing it in your classroom to talk about the weekend, that they get used to using those verb forms that are putting it in the past. Again, if your language has a past tense and does it that way. So this would be 10 or 15 minutes. You don't want to spend too much time on it. Do one student, maybe it's part of their special person interview, but model responses. That's a really good tip for it. Model the responses before asking students to share. And you can also use visual supports like pictures or timelines to help with comprehension. The timeline helps because the whole point of doing the weekend chat is to focus on the previous actions and to move outside of what's happening at the present time. So that's a weekend chat. And the sixth and last activity in this category is calendar talks. And I also had an episode, number 170, when I spoke with John Seifert, who is Padre de Cinco, and we talked all about how to do calendar talks. So I encourage you to listen back at that episode. And the next couple of weeks, you'll also see a specific episode that I will do on how I do calendar talks specifically in my class and how I've honed it in from a couple of different ideas. So you can listen to episode 170 with John Seifert and be on the lookout for a new episode that I will do in the next couple of weeks. But the idea of a calendar talk is to discuss the day, the date, and the weather, and any special events that are happening. So starting your class with that specific thing and using the target language to build in routine. So the episode that I did with John Seifert was all focused on calendar talk being so much more than just the date and all the other things you can do with it. So I recommend you listen to that episode and be on the lookout for the episode I'll be doing as well. And this is something we want to spend 5 or 7 minutes on. It's not going to take up your entire class. It's part of the routine for the beginning. And so a tip for success with this is to incorporate questions and student participation and not to just do one student and then move on. And then again, use visuals and calendars, weather icons, and anything that will help support, particularly if they are novice level students. If you have more intermediate to advanced level students, you can definitely talk about things that happened on this date in history. So you're using the past. You can talk about what could be happening during this month or this date next year. You know, what's happening in your family on this day. So you can go much more in depth. And I know a lot of times these CI activities can feel novice level, but there are ways to bring them into that intermediate level. And this is one of them where you could do that with the calendar talk. Now, the second category that I'm going to look at here is storytelling and narrative. So these are activities that involve students in telling stories and narratives, and they're offering a really strong, rich context for language acquisition through listening and speaking. And it's all about embedding the language into a narrative, into a story. Stories are so powerful. So the first activity we'll look at here is story listening. And this is where you are telling a story in the target language. And you're using gestures or drawings, props, anything like that so that you are aiding students in their comprehension. You're enhancing the comprehension with all of these ways to make the story comprehensible to students. Now, the thing about story listening is it is very much the teachers telling the story, and it's not involving students in creating the story. They're very much just focusing on comprehension. You're not even doing comprehension checks. So this is really about students just honing in and listening to what the story is. And this is something that takes a little bit of stamina since students aren't directly interacting with it. So maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes max, depending on the level. And a tip for this would be to choose stories that are simple and engaging and that also use repetition and variation to reinforce key vocabulary and structures. So it's not every single sentence is something new, but you are using common structures and vocabulary so students are understanding it and not feeling like they're lost because they're not understanding something in every other sentence. Now, way back in episode 91, I spoke with Margarita Perez Garcia, and we talked all about the theory behind story listening and the founder of it and how she uses it with her students. So the link to that episode is in the show notes if you really want to dive deep into this idea of story listening. And the second activity in this category is a write and discuss. Now, this is something that I find really helpful and I do all the time in my classroom. So after a class discussion or a storytelling activity, you write a summary together as a class, reinforcing the language that was used. So the students are providing the details, but you as the teacher are either writing on the board or typing on a document that you have projected, and students can be writing that down as well. Or they could just be using your model for the discussion after. But the reason I like this so much is all of the details and the language are provided by the students, so the text is very comprehensible, and it also is that formative way for us to see what students understood from what they watched or a discussion or an activity in class. And I usually allow 10 to 15 minutes for this. So a tip for this is to make sure that you encourage student input during the writing process, and then use that written summary as a reading activity in the next lesson or the opening to a next lesson. And I first learned about this whole concept back on episode 79 that I did about 2.5 years ago with Ben Fisher Rodriguez. So if you want to go back and listen to that, I have the episode link in the show notes as well. But I highly recommend using a write and discuss. And then the third activity in this category is a movie talk. Now, this is where we play a short video clip and then pause to describe the scenes, ask questions, and then discuss what's happening in the target language. You can also take screenshots and have it, on a Google Doc or on a PowerPoint slide and then use that, or you can just use the video without the sound and to be talking about what's going on as you're going through. This could take an entire class, so you could do it for 15 to 20 minutes, but I would suggest that you choose clips with clear visuals and minimal dialogue because you're not focusing on the dialogue to tell the story so much because you're using still frames to talk about it, or you're pausing and having students try to figure out what's going to happen. So pre-watch the clips to plan the pauses where you're going to pause it and ask those questions, and then figure out what your key discussion points are going to be, and maybe even some vocabulary that you want to make sure comes out. So even if students are not offering up the responses that you're particularly looking for, you can maybe scaffold it in to make sure that you're getting to particular vocabulary as you're going through. I had an excellent discussion about movie talks back on episode 31 at the very beginning of this podcast journey, and I spoke with Sarah Mogtatter, and she gave lots of really useful tips for doing movie talk in your classroom. So episode 31, the link is also in the show notes if you want to do a deep dive into movie talks. And the last category is reading and writing. Now, these activities are designed to reinforce comprehension, but then also writing skills that are structured and interactive as well. So the first activity is what we call one word at a time. So this is where we create a story with the class, adding one word at a time and encouraging creativity and language use. So again, students are going to be using language that they have, which means that the story will end up being very comprehensible in the end. But if students are wanting to add a detail in and they don't have the word for it, this is a perfect opportunity to supply that word to them and then add it into the story. This is something we want to do for 10 to 12 minutes. You don't want to spend too much time on it. And a success tip for this would be to start with a prompt or a theme to guide the story. Don't just say once a man walked into, and then it can kind of go anywhere. So you want to start with a prompt or a theme. So you want to say, we want this to be a story about a girl who won a basketball game last week. So that's where we're going with this, so they can keep it focused and go in, and they could say that she practiced or she didn't practice, or her friends were there, or her family was there, or when it was, or whether or not she even likes basketball. So all these different things that can come up in there, but it keeps it focused on a theme rather than just going anywhere. And so once you start the story, allow students to suggest words and phrases and provide those inputs as needed, but it'll be focused on that particular theme. The second activity in this category is a big concept of just embedded reading and just having students read. So you present a text in the target language at various levels of complexity and gradually revealing more details as the student comprehension grows. So this is something, again, we want to do for about 15 or 25 minutes. And when you're doing this, I would suggest that you begin with a simplified version of a story and ask comprehension questions before moving the text to the next level. So you start with a very simple version of the story, and then you add on more details to the story, and then have students predict what might happen, make connections to other readings, but start simple and then have a 3-sentence story. Then make it a 5-sentence story. Then make it a 2-paragraph story. So each time you re-engage with the story, you're adding more details into it. You're making it a little more complex. And then you have students engaging with it that way. So that's what we're referring to when we say an embedded reading. The next activity is volleyball reading, and I spoke with Ashley Mickelson back on episode 86 about this, and again, that episode is in the show notes if you want to click on that link and read lots of ideas about reading in the classroom, but this was one that she shared there, and this is where you use a CI novel or short story, and working in pairs, one student reads a sentence or paragraph in the target language, then the other student translates, then they switch. So the student that translated then reads a sentence in the target language and the other student switches, and have them do this for 15 or 20 minutes. And a suggestion for this would be to choose texts that are at students' proficiency level and that they know really well, so they can focus on the language structures and vocabulary. This idea of doing the volleyball reading is not about a challenging text that students may be struggling with. It should be one they know really well and they're confident with, and they actually can translate it all. And it's a good way to see if they're able to do it or not, and if they're not, then their level of comprehension is probably not that great, and you should spend some more time on it. So it's a good formative assessment by watching how that goes. The fourth activity is the draw the sentence. So this is fun, again, working with a CI novel or short story. So working in pairs, each student selects a sentence from the reading, or it could be an informational text or anything you're using. And based on that sentence, each student draws a quick and simple picture to represent it. Then they exchange the picture with somebody else in their group, and then they take the reading and they try to locate the sentence in the text or the reading that represents the picture that they got. So this would be about 15 or 20 minutes. And again, I would say choose texts that are definitely at the student's proficiency level, and so that they can quickly locate the sentence so that they have an idea of what it is. Because if they know the story really well, then they're not looking for random sentences. They could say, oh, this is the picture of, and they know exactly where this happened in the story and in the text, so they can find it pretty quickly once they know where to go and look for it. But again, they are showing their understanding and engaging with it that way. The fifth activity is a running dictation, and this is where you place sentences around the classroom and students can work in pairs, where one student is running to read the sentence, and then the other student is going to write it down. So I run to the other side of the room, I see the sentence, I run back to my partner, and I say the sentence, and they write it down. So if you're doing this, just ensure that the sentences are short and related to the current classroom theme, so you can emphasize accuracy in both the reading and the writing. So you don't want it to be random topics. It should be maybe the story that you're reading. Maybe it's the chapter that you're reading. It could be be something that's going to happen in the next chapter. I've done this where I'll have 10 sentences that they do that actually tells the entire next chapter in the book we're going to read. And after they've done them all, we have a discussion and I say, so what's going to happen in the next chapter? And then they read it and they're like, oh my God, that was exactly what we just did in our running dictation. So it's a good way to have them be ready for the next chapter, but you tell it in language that's completely comprehensible. And then when they read it with that I+1, they already know what's going to happen, so they can figure out those smaller details that they wouldn't have got early on. And then the last activity in this section is the dictation with a twist. Now, this is where you read a sentence out loud and then have students write it down. It's very typical. That's the way you do a dictation. But then have students modify it based on a prompt. So once they write the sentence, you can say, now put it in the past. Now say that it happened yesterday. Or now add a detail to it. Add a color to something. Add a person to the sentence, or rewrite it so that there is a pronoun in the sentence. So you can do things where you're focusing specifically on language structures as you're going through. This is a 10-15 minute activity, and a tip for this would be to start with simple sentences and then gradually increase the complexity so that students get used to understanding how this is going to work, and provide prompts that encourage creativity and really using the language in different ways. So those were a ton of activities in all three of those categories, 15 total, many that take 10, 15, 20 minutes that you can use all over in your classroom. As I mentioned earlier, you can get the CI Toolbox document that has all of these details in it right in the show notes or at wolclassroom.com/toolbox. It has all 15 of these activities with all of the descriptions that I have shared, that you've seen other places my guests have shared as well. So as you're also in the show notes, make sure you look at those other episodes that I referenced throughout if you want to go back and do a deep dive into those topics. And also you'll see the link for Talking Points, which is my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. And there are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. And remember, we can do that either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, wolclassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.